Hi, this is Kalyan Kaki. I'm a principal program manager lead with Microsoft Azure, and I lead the team of program managers that are building Nutanix clusters in Azure. I'm here joined today by Laura Jardana, who is a technical marketing engineer from Nutanix, to talk about Nutanix clusters in Azure. Hey, Laura, how are you?
I'm doing well, Kalyan. Thanks. How about yourself?
Oh, not too bad. This year, to start with, has been really interesting. We are in this new normal of remote work, kids and pets popping into meetings all the time, and virtual high face. On a more serious note, I think education, businesses, they have seen the digital transformation at a pace that they have never imagined they would be able to do. By the way, how are you guys holding up there?
Yeah, so I mean, here at Nutanix, it's definitely been a bit of a challenge, but with the power of remote collaboration tools, such as Microsoft Teams, and being able to leverage cloud services, we've been holding up fairly well. And speaking of digital experiences and transformation, one of the things that we released just before this all happened, which was kind of perfect timing, was Nutanix Test Drive, which really allows our customers to try Nutanix products from the comfort of their web browser. So this is ideal for the situation that we're in now, where we can't travel to customer sites and be physically in front of customers as much. Well, one second, sorry, I'm getting a ping from my boss here. So it looks like we're seeing a lot of demand for Test Drive today, and he wants me to spin up some more resources to cover that demand. So we'll have to do that as well on this call.
Oh, yeah, and that should be super easy for you, right? Oh, by the way, great timing getting Nutanix Test Drive going. And with the partnership we have, bursting out your Nutanix Test Drive into Azure should be super easy for you, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So standing up a Nutanix private cloud in general is typically relatively quick compared to legacy on-prem solutions, but it can still, of course, take some time to procure on-prem hardware to run our software on. So we might be looking at several weeks or even months in some cases to stand something up. But thanks to our hybrid cloud partnership, which is powered by Nutanix clusters on Azure, we're able to spin up resources in just a few clicks from our clusters portal, and within 45 minutes or so, we have Nutanix running in the Azure cloud.
Yep. Love how we have been able to innovate together. It is now super easy and efficient for our joint customers to provision what they want and when they want. Why don't we start our series with a quick demo on how the provisioning experience works for our customers?
Sure. So as a current Microsoft customer, I can go straight to the Azure Marketplace to launch Nutanix clusters on Azure. So I can either use my existing Nutanix investments by porting my existing licenses over, or I can procure Nutanix software directly from the Azure Marketplace, leveraging my cloud budget to account towards both hardware and software. Now, once I click on Setup and Subscribe, I'll be directed to the Nutanix Clusters portal, where I can configure my Azure account. So I'll provide the details of my Azure subscription and my Clusters app registration, and I can verify those credentials here as well, so we make sure everything is valid and ready to go. And then I'll select the regions that I want to deploy my clusters into. And once this account is created, I can then go ahead and start provisioning clusters. So I'll jump into the Clusters tab here, and I'll click on Create Cluster. I'll select the cloud account that I just created and the region I want to deploy to. And the cool thing about this is that I'm able to use my existing VNets and subnets. It's discovering those directly from my Azure account. And so I don't have to create new ones. Now on the second screen, I'll provide the details of my cluster, such as the number of nodes and the Nutanix software version, and any add-on products I want to add, and some other configurations we can do here. And then on the final page, we'll review the selections and click on Create. Again, the provisioning process takes about 45 minutes, but once it's complete, I'll be able to seamlessly expand my apps across on-prem and the cloud.
Yep. So let me talk a little bit about what was happening there. So behind the scenes, when you go to Prism Portal and say provision those nodes for me, the Prism Portal is integrated with Azure Resource Provider. It tells the Azure Resource Provider how many nodes are required, where they are required, and the Azure Resource Provider intercepts the call, goes, provisions these nodes, bootstraps the Nutanix AOS operating system with some tooling that Nutanix team has been able to do for us or with us. And voila, you have your nodes being made available to you in Azure VNet, like you said, within 45 minutes. So let's talk a little bit about the Nutanix HCI stack itself.
Sure. So yeah. So what are we actually installing on these bare metal nodes? So Nutanix really pioneered the HCI space. So what we're doing here is installing our AOS software on these Azure bare metal nodes. And the way the software works is that we deploy a virtualized storage controller running as a VM onto each node. So effectively, this is providing a distributed storage fabric that brings the storage controllers you typically find in a traditional SAN. We're bringing these to the compute layer so that we eliminate the bottleneck between your servers and your storage. So what can happen in a siloed environment in a traditional 3-tier is that the more servers you add, the lower your performance gets because you're still funneling through those same set of storage controllers. But with Nutanix AOS, every node that you deploy has its own storage controller. And what that storage controller is doing is it's pooling together the storage from all the nodes in the cluster and presenting it to your hypervisor, to Nutanix AHV, as a single shared namespace for you to provision your VMs and your applications on. And then under the covers, these controllers will manage the I/O and are responsible for distributing the data across the nodes for high availability and resiliency. They're handling garbage collection, automatic rebuilds if a disk fails, and much, much more.
Yep, go HCI. Now that the Nutanix clusters are provisioned in Azure, other than AOS, what else can the Nutanix administrator do?
Yeah, so in the Nutanix clusters portal where we did the provisioning, we can manage all of our clusters in Azure. And on the cluster details page, we can get more information and we can jump into Prism. But first, let's jump into a cost governance product that we can also get to from this details page called Beam by Nutanix. And so Nutanix Beam allows you to monitor your public cloud spend and delivers cost savings by optimizing infrastructure and providing reserved instance purchase recommendations from Azure. So Beam is able to do this by analyzing resource metrics such as CPU, memory, disks, etc. So here on the overview page, if I click on optimize, we can see where Beam's discovered underutilized resources that I could potentially have savings on. And then I can also eliminate these directly from Beam as well. And as I mentioned, it's also able to make reserved instance purchase recommendations. So for example, if you had some instances running at a steady utilization 24/7, it may make more sense to convert this to a reserved instance instead of on demand. So this would result in a more optimal hybrid cloud consumption, and Beam can discover and show this to you as well. So back to your original question about what a cluster actually looks like after it's provisioned. So let's jump back into the cluster details page, and I can go directly to Prism from that clusters portal. And so we can see we're running on an Azure Nutanix Ready node, and I can manage this Azure cluster as well as all my other clusters from Prism Central, which gives me a single pane of glass into my entire environment. So Prism Central allows me to manage all of my clusters from a single UI, and this is where we'll create VMs and manage our storage, and we can easily move workloads between on-prem and cloud. So we have that visibility and manageability into our entire environment, regardless of where resources are actually located.
Easy. So basically all of the Nutanix stack, not just AOS, and running in Azure bare metals. So one of the key benefits in cloud has been ability to enable fast lift and shift or elegant lift and shift, expand at will, which is burst, which is also called bursting, in case you have a certain surge in demand, and most importantly, disaster recovery. Why don't we talk about how disaster recovery for Nutanix clusters works when you have deployed your clusters in Azure?
Definitely, yeah. So you hit the nail on the head. That's one of the key benefits of clusters on Azure is the ability to move your applications from your Nutanix on-prem cluster to your Nutanix cluster running in Azure without any refactoring needed. So true cloud native. So this is ideal for a DR scenario. So let's say I'm running some of my web servers here on-prem, and we can see the app here. We're running a simple e-commerce app. Now, this is running in my on-prem cluster, but I get an alert that says my data center connectivity is down. So since I've already created a protection policy and recovery plan when I set up this application, we can do a simple unplanned failover of these VMs and have everything up and running. So let me back up and talk a little bit about some of these constructs. So a protection policy allows us to specify our RPO and retention policies. And so we'll define our recovery location, we'll define our RPO, and as well as our retention policy, which can either be linear, which will keep a certain number of snapshots, or roll up, which is time-based. And then I'll go ahead and choose linear here, and then I'll set the number of snapshots I want to keep remote and locally. And then the final step in a protection policy is to add our categories. And our categories are basically tags that we can apply to VMs. So if we ever create new VMs, we can add them to a particular category, and they'll be automatically protected by way of the protection policy, depending on what categories we have defined in our policy. Now, once we have a protection policy set up, we then set up a recovery plan, which is a policy that will orchestrate the recovery of entities at the remote location. So this is where we'll define things like our power on sequence and our network mappings. So we'll go ahead and just walk through the recovery plan setup. We'll just give it a name, and then we select a power on sequence so we can have different stages of powering on, and we can filter by VM name or select by category. And so in this case, I'm going to separate my VMs, then I want my SQL server to come up first, so I'm going to put that in the first stage. We can then add another stage and add our web front end, for example, and then I can put a delay in between these stages so that we want our SQL server to come up, and then 10 seconds later, power on the web front end to make sure SQL is up. And then the final step in a recovery plan is to set up our network mappings between on-prem and the remote, or your local and remote, for the production and test networks. And our VMs will automatically be assigned IPs with matching offset values. So if it's 10.19.0.100 on the primary site, and we're looking at 10.88.5 on the remote, our VM is going to have an IP of 10.88.5.100. So you'll know your IP prior to failover without any extra work. But you can always override this if needed, but it really takes a lot of the guesswork out, and you can just be up and running if you have those network mappings configured. So this is how you set up a protection policy and recovery plan, but I'm just going to go ahead and jump into an existing recovery plan and show how we perform a failover. So once inside the recovery plan, you can simply click on failover. We'll specify what recovery point to recover from, whether we want to do planned or unplanned. And then once that the VMs are powered on the remote site, if we have all that network mapping set up the way we want it, we'll be able to just jump into our Azure public IP and have our e-commerce app running there.
Awesome. I love how you said remote site. In this case, Azure is your remote site, which is as good as any remote site you have.
Exactly.
One of our common design goals, which is also the hardest, is seamless network integration. When you were demoing the experience, you did show a little bit about how these nodes are provisioned directly into Azure VNet. I do want to talk a little bit about what was happening there. So over the past few years, Microsoft has been innovating and figuring out ways to extend the software-defined networking stack for assets that are owned by partners like Nutanix. In this case, the Azure Nutanix Ready nodes. We've been able to successfully do that, and now all of your Azure native VNet features are eventually extended into the partner assets like Nutanix clusters in Azure. Speaking of which, why don't you delve a little bit into it and show how the seamless integration looks like, network integration looks like?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, when we saw in the provisioning process, we were able to select our Azure VNets that were existing in our Azure account. So with this native integration, our Nutanix user VMs that we create within Prism are able to get low latency direct access to these Azure services, without any overlaid network or edge gateways. So if I jump into the Azure portal here, we can configure our virtual networks. And let me just pick a particular virtual network, and we can see that we're using address space 10.60.0.0/16. And we have some connected devices on this network. Now back in the Prism UI, we can see one of our Nutanix user VMs is connected to this network with that IP. And if we take a look at the network configuration in Prism, we can see multiple native Azure networks defined. So again, any VMs running on any of these Azure networks, there's no extra hops or anything between them and the Azure services. So they have direct access to things like ExpressRoute, VPN gateway, blob store, load balancers, etc.
Yep. So both Nutanix and Azure assets all in the same VNet using the same encapsulation and decapsulation mechanism that every other Azure asset works. So I noticed when you were provisioning, you specified a number of nodes for the cluster. We talked about bursting from on-prem into Azure. Let's talk a little bit about how to expand capacity and what sort of automation exists for that.
Definitely, yeah. So one of my favorite things about Nutanix is how fast I can clone VMs. So I'm going to go ahead and clone a few VMs here from my existing VM. And again, we can look at the network that we're configuring against. And so it's going to use that same native Azure network. But let's say, we've provisioned a bunch of VMs and we've increased our workload on our cluster, and now our CPU and memory usage is, going almost to the max, just as an example, right? So from the same interface where I provision my cluster, I can also add additional capacity to the cluster. So for example, in the cluster details page, I'll click on the capacity tab, and I can expand the cluster seamlessly from, for example, 3 to 5 nodes. But this can also be automated, as you mentioned. So with the Prism Pro Crossplay feature, I can set up automated runbooks to automatically expand my cluster if we see an increase in load. So hopping back into Prism Central here, I can configure playbooks that can be triggered based on an alert or other types of triggers to automate all types of actions. So navigating over to playbooks, I can see I have a playbook here called Auto Expand. And Auto Expand, what that does is it alerts on a memory alert on a cluster, and it will perform a couple of actions that we'll drill into. So if we drill into this, we can see it's getting alerted on a memory capacity alert. And if we click Update, we can see we can define other alerts as well. And the alert that we define is going to be associated with a particular entity, such as clusters, VMs, etc. And so for this particular example, we could trigger this against all clusters in the environment, or just a specific cluster as we're doing here, or clusters that are assigned specific categories. So that's the first half of a playbook. And the second half is the actions that we take based on this trigger. So here we're doing a couple of actions. First one is we're doing an SSH command into a VM that we have running. That's running a script that will make an API call to do that cluster expansion as just same way we did it in the UI. And then the second action that we take is we're sending an email to alert somebody that this cluster has been expanded. And you can customize the parameters of the subject and the body. And you can also add additional actions as well. So you can chain together different actions, such as hot adding memory to a VM or a CPU or expanding the disk. You can send alerts to specific webhooks. Make a call to a REST API endpoint. So you can chain together different actions to create really powerful workflows.
That's awesome. Automation is the key for simplifying management, and the ability to bring your own automation, not just your assets from on-premises, is just super advantageous. And at the same time, ability to burst into cloud, lift and shift into cloud, this is all fantastic, right? Now, while we talked about the common scenarios of expanding your data center into Azure, one of my favorite aspects with this collaboration is Arc. The ability to modernize your on-premises footprint with the magic of Nutanix, Carbon, and Arc together is the next phase of this partnership. Why don't we talk about how customers who want to modernize their apps on the data center can leverage both Nutanix Carbon and Azure Arc to bring app modernization to life?
Yeah, so using Nutanix Carbon, I can easily spin up Kubernetes clusters from directly within Prism Central. My Kubernetes cluster could be running on-prem, or it could be running in the cloud with Nutanix clusters on Azure. And then with Azure Arc, I can manage all of my Kubernetes clusters, regardless of if they're running in my hybrid cloud with Nutanix Carbon, or even cloud native using something like AKS. So jumping into my Prism Central here, I'm running a 5-node Kubernetes cluster in Carbon. I'm running 3 workers and 2 masters. And I can manage this using standard kubectl commands. So we can see our 5 nodes here. And we can also see that we are running a service on the standard port 80. So we can jump into that IP and we can see our favorite e-commerce app running on port 80. Now, if I'm already in the Azure management plane, I can manage that same cluster using the native Azure Arc services. So we can see we have that Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes resource, and we can get information about our cluster. So we can see the version and the node count and much more, actually. So drilling into this a bit more, we can get deeper insights onto the infrastructure. So we can see the health of those nodes and the different processes that are running, as well as get metrics on different things, for example, disk I/O. And so we're able to manage and monitor our cluster directly from Azure, even though it's running on Nutanix Carbon.
Awesome. That is so cool. Now I really feel like I want to go back to my data center management days. Anyways, now let's push this a little bit further. Let's show how we are bringing it together with GitOps.
Yeah, so with the Azure GitOps integration, I can make a change to that application and have it automatically applied to all my managed clusters, all my managed Kubernetes clusters. So I have my configuration defined here, which is syncing with a Git repository. So I can make a change to that application and with a single Git push, have it applied across all of my clusters that are leveraging this configuration. So for example, let's make a simple port change to our application. So instead of running on port 80, we'll run it on port 9000. So I just have to make that change once to my YAML file and do a commit and a push. And this will be applied to all my clusters that are managed with that configuration that's synced to that GitOps or to that Git repository. And so effectively what we're able to do here is create a CI/CD pipeline using Azure, which is able to manage our Nutanix Carbon cluster that is running in our on-prem data center. So that's really creating a true hybrid experience where we have Azure services running in the public cloud, managing our on-prem workloads. And so we can see here, once that takes effect, we're able to now access our application on the new port.
Fantastic. And we're just getting started, right? I just can't wait to get these into the hands of our customers for them to try the innovation out and both modernize their apps or do an easy lift and shift or burst into cloud, no matter what your scenario is, right? So we talked about frictionless experience to deploy, consume services. Let me also talk about a little bit about how we intend to make this frictionless for your business planning teams. So Laura mentioned you would have the ability to bring your own Nutanix licenses into Azure. You can also purchase Nutanix licenses through Azure Marketplace using your MACC commitments. And the bare metal the bare metal Nutanix ready nodes are also eligible for your Mac commitments. In addition to that, we are also giving you extended service updates for the Nutanix nodes running in Azure, and also giving you the Azure hybrid benefits. To sum it all, this is best of Nutanix, best of Azure, all together with your existing investments. Be sure to catch up with the rest of the Microsoft Ignite excitement. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Kalyan. It sounds so awesome, and I'm really excited as well to get this to the hands of our customers and help them with their hybrid cloud, initiatives. So for more information on the Nutanix and Azure partnership, please check out the Nutanix featured partner page. So you can find the link to it from the Microsoft Ignite homepage under Partner Stories. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.